The candles in the long gallery of Ashford Park had burned down to their last inch when Cecily Hartwell understood that she was about to do the bravest thing she had ever done, and that no one in that room would see it as courage. She stood at the edge of the assembly, 30 faces turned away from her toward the spectacle, being conducted in the center of the floor, her borrowed mantle already gathered over her arm, her gloves smoothed to their careful seams. The document was still in Lady Dorothea Ashford's hand. The solicitor, Mr. Edmund Fitch, stood 4 paces behind the dowager, with the particular stillness of a man who has been used as a weapon and is only beginning to understand it. And James Ashford, Duke of Ashford, stood at the far end of the room, with his jaw like carved stone and his eyes the color of smoke over ice, not yet looking at her. She had learned, in the 3 days she had spent inside this house, that his not looking was itself a form of attention. She had learned it too late. Cecily straightened the borrowed mantle over her arm, turned toward the corridor door, and prepared to disappear from his life with the same invisibility with which she had arrived in it. What she did not yet know was that he had already crossed the room before she took her second step. She had come to Ashford Park as nobody, in particular, which was a category she knew well by now. Her cousin, Miss Priscilla Vane, had received the house party invitation through a chain of social connections that Cecily could trace only dimly, and had asked Cecily to accompany her as companion with the brisk charity of someone who understands that useful poor relations. Cecily had accepted with the brisk gratitude of someone who understands the same arithmetic from the other side. Her father had been dead 14 months. His debts, £412 of them, were settled in the technical sense that a solicitor had arranged their recording, but they sat in the family's history like a stone in a shallow stream, visible to anyone who cared to look. She had one evening gown, gray-blue silk, retrimmed with new ribbon at the cuffs and throat, the ribbon a shade lighter than the silk, which was a thing everyone in a room of this kind would notice and no one would mention. She had Priscilla's spare mantle, deep blue wool with a velvet edge, which was a great kindness and also 3 inches too long. She had her own hands, which were steady, and her own eyes, which were not. Ashford Park had received her without comment. The housekeeper, Mrs. Metter Holt, a woman of 60 years and the particular authority of someone who has managed a great house through 2 changes of ownership, had shown Cecily to a room in the east corridor, smaller than the others and warmer for it, with a view of the kitchen garden under frost. Mrs. Holt had noted the borrowed mantle on the peg behind the door, without any change in her expression, which Cecily understood to be its own form of courtesy. The house itself was large in the way of old things that have never needed to prove it. Dark oak on the staircase, pale stone in the entrance hall, fires in every room that had been told to expect guests. Portraits on the long gallery walls, most of them except for one conspicuous rectangle near the inner window, where the silk damask showed a square of brighter color, as though a painting had hung there long enough to shield the wall behind it from light, and had been removed recently. Cecily noticed it. She was careful not to ask about it. She first saw the Duke of Ashford in the doorway of the dining room on the evening of her arrival, when the house party guests were assembling for supper, and the noise of 30 people finding their places produced the particular chaos of precedence being silently calculated in every direction. He stood at the threshold and let the room arrange itself, neither directing it nor participating in it, present the way a fixed point is present in a turning field. He was 35 or 36 years old, she judged, with the kind of face that had once been handsome in an open way and had been closed by time into something more severe and more interesting. His eyes moved across the assembled guests with the impersonal efficiency of a man cataloging weather. They moved across Cecily and paused for perhaps 2 seconds, and then continued. She told herself the pause meant nothing. Lady Dorothea Ashford arrived in the drawing-room after supper with the bearing of a woman who has spent 30 years understanding exactly where the center of every room is and walking directly to it. She was 60 years old, if Cecily estimated correctly, and wore her diamonds with the ease of long familiarity, as though the stones were simply part of her face. She identified Cecily within the first 5 minutes in the manner of someone who has been told a thing they already suspected. She did not speak to Cecily directly. She spoke to Mrs. Preet Vane, Priscilla's mother, who had also made the journey, and she spoke with perfect surface warmth. "Miss Hartwell," she said in the aside that was clearly intended for the 3 women nearest her, "is the daughter of that Hartwell, I believe. A Hampshire connection. Very little to speak of now. Very little to speak of now." The words settled over Cecily like the first breath of a room that has been too long closed. She registered them, noted the specific quality of the dismissal, and continued her conversation with a young woman named Miss Alderton about the plasterwork ceiling, which was genuinely fine. This was the procedure she had developed over 14 months of managed reduction. The incoming wound, the acknowledgement of it to no one, the continued motion. Dignity did not require an audience to be real. She had tested this theory often enough to trust it. The following morning, the frost on the kitchen garden had thickened overnight, and Cecily had risen early because she had always slept poorly in unfamiliar houses, and because the east corridor window was the kind of thing one looked at when sleep would not come. She dressed without her maid, which she had done since the maid was let go the previous spring. She was competent at the practical work of her own person. She could manage hooks she could not see, pins she had to place by feel alone, and she thought sometimes that this small daily self-sufficiency was the one inheritance her reduced circumstances had given her. Outright. She found the parlour-maid, a girl of 16 named Agnes, on a chair in the lower servants' hall, coughing badly enough that she had given up on her morning work and simply sat with her hands folded and the look of someone waiting for permission to be unwell. The housekeeper had not yet come down. The other servants moved around Agnes with the efficient sympathy of people who could not afford to stop. Cecily sat down next to her and asked her name and asked whether she had eaten. And when Agnes said she had not, Cecily went to the kitchen herself and returned with a bowl of porridge and the small book she had carried in her pocket since her father's death. A collection of English verse, printed small. She read aloud while Agnes ate, slowly choosing the shorter poems, the ones with the quality of light in them rather than grandeur, the ones that felt like windows rather than monuments. She did not know anyone was watching. She learned later what his face had been doing in the doorway. Not then, not in any useful time, but much later in the winter, when there were no more reasons to withhold. He had come to the servants' hall because Mrs. Surratt. Holt had told him Agnes was unwell, and he had wanted to verify this himself, which was the kind of detail about him that would not have surprised Cecily had she known it, because by then she understood that his concern for the people under his roof was not sentiment, but responsibility, and that he made very little distinction between those of high estate and those of low. He had stopped in the doorway when he heard the voice, and he had stayed there for the length of 3 poems, because he had not been able to make himself leave. He had not spoken. She had not turned around. What he had been doing in that doorway was remembering something he had believed he would never allow himself to remember again. The turned portrait in the long gallery was Eleanor Ashford's. She had died 2 years and 4 months before this winter party. In the 3rd month of a confinement she had not survived, and the child had not survived either. The Duke had removed the portrait from the wall himself in the week after the funeral, and had told Mrs. Holt that it was being sent to be reframed. It had not been sent anywhere. It stood with its face to the wall in the small room off the library that had once been Eleanor's private sitting room, and the door to that room was kept closed. The guests at the house party stepped around this fact, the way guests step around furniture placed slightly wrong in a hallway, by feel, without looking directly at it. What no one in the house party knew, because he had not told anyone and would not have known how to say it if asked, was that Eleanor had also read aloud in exactly that quality of voice, slow and chosen, and without performance. She had read to the servants when they were ill. She had read to the children of the tenants on wet afternoons in the kitchen. She had possessed a particular understanding that the words meant more when they were given freely and without ceremony, and he had loved her for it among a long list of things he had loved her for. And when she was gone, the list had become a charge he could not discharge, and a wound he wore as discipline. If you have stayed with Cecily this far, you already understand what he saw in that doorway. Leave a word in the comments, if you like, and come back for the rest. The house party continued in its ordered way through the second day. The men rode out to survey the winter fields in the morning. The women occupied the drawing room with needlework and music, and the careful exchange of social information. Priscilla played the pianoforte creditably, and was complimented by Miss Vivian Crail, who was the guest Cecily had been watching without seeming to watch since the first supper. Miss Crail was 22 years old, and wore her amber silk the way she wore everything, as though the garment and the occasion and the room had been designed together with her at the center. She was lovely in the polished, intentional way of a woman who has been told since childhood that her loveliness is the most useful thing about her. And she was kind enough, in the surface manner of someone who has never been required to be kind in any way that cost anything. Lady Dorothea arranged their proximity the way one arranges furniture, with a kind of practiced inevitability. At the evening gathering, the Dowager steered Miss Crail toward the Duke with the smoothness of long practice, and Cecily watched from her usual position, at the edge of the assembly near the window, slightly outside the warmth of the main grouping, as the Duke received Miss Crail with perfect politeness and precisely no warmth. He was looking past Miss Crail when he looked up. His eyes found Cecily's for the length of 2 seconds, maybe 3. His expression did not change. He looked back to Miss Crail and spoke whatever appropriate thing was required. Cecily looked away first toward the frost on the window glass, and pressed the flat of her wrist against a cold pane, till she felt her pulse slow. The dismissive label arrived again that evening in the drawing room, voiced this time in the register of social fact rather than private aside. Lady Dorothea, addressing the small group gathered nearest the fire, spoke with the satisfied confidence of someone completing a sentence. They began weeks earlier. "Miss Hartwell is very good company for Priscilla," she said. And the pause before the next clause was the whole weight of the thing. "For the sort of quiet help one needs when one hasn't quite the resources to manage alone." Her family situation, you understand. 3 women in that group understood, and their faces arranged themselves into the particular expression of sympathy that is composed primarily of relief at one's own position. Cecily, seated 4 feet away at the embroidery frame, kept her needle moving. The stitch she was setting was a French knot, and it required a specific tension, and she concentrated on that tension with the focused attention of a woman who has learned that needlework is an excellent reason not to look up. One of the women, Mrs. Alderton, her daughter's mother, glanced at Cecily with a faint trouble crossing her face, and looked away again. The Duke had entered the drawing room as his mother finished speaking. Cecily did not know how much of it he had heard. His face, when she glanced at it from the embroidery frame, was the color and temperature of pale stone. He crossed toward his mother with 3 quiet level steps, and said something to her in a voice too low for the room to catch. Lady Dorothea's chin lifted exactly half an inch. Her eyes moved to Cecily, calculating, and then back to her son. She smiled. The smile of a woman who has decided to grant a point on the understanding that the campaign continues, and turned to introduce him to someone else. He did not look at Cecily again that evening. She was almost sure of it. The third day brought snow, thin and steady, from a sky the color of pewter, and the house party guests arranged themselves around the inside of Ashford Park, with the comfortable variety of people who have been delivered from any obligation to go outdoors. Cecily went to the library. She had not been explicitly invited to use the library. She had also not been explicitly forbidden from it. She had observed over 3 days that the rooms of Ashford Park operated on the assumption that guests of reasonable breeding would navigate their own usage, and that the only rooms requiring specific permission were the ones whose doors were visibly closed. The library door was open. She had been there an hour, with a volume of natural history propped on the reading stand, and the snow building quietly on the sill outside, when she heard the door to the small room off the library open. The door that was always kept closed. She did not move. She heard footsteps cross the small room, and stop, and a long silence that had the quality of a man standing still in front of something he cannot look away from. When he came through into the library, he stopped. When he saw her, his hand still on the doorframe, his face carrying the particular flatness of a man who has just put something back inside himself. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She moved to close the natural history volume and stand. "Stay," he said, and then more levelly, "Please, you are not disturbing anything." She stayed. He crossed to the far window and stood with his back half turned to her, watching the snow. She looked at her book. The silence between them was not the silence of two strangers avoiding conversation. It was something more careful than that, as though both of them were paying attention to the same thing from different directions. He asked her after a time what she was reading. She told him. He asked whether she had an interest in natural history, or whether the book had simply been nearest. She said with the faint dryness she permitted herself only when she was reasonably sure it would land, that she had been reaching for the volume of poetry beside it, but the natural history had turned out to be more interesting than she had expected. Something moved at the edge of his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that exists in the territory where a smile could form, if the person had not decided years ago that forming it would cost too much. He said, without looking at her, that Eleanor had preferred poetry to natural history. Cecily understood that this was not a small thing for him to have said. She did not treat it as a small thing. She did not treat it as a large one either, because that would have been wrong in a different direction. She said only that she supposed the two were not always in competition. He looked at her then, fully for the first time. His eyes were gray. She saw now not the smoke color she had attributed to distance, but a clear winter gray, with the quality of light on still water. She held his gaze for exactly the time it took for the word Eleanor to settle into her understanding of everything that had been closed in this house. "No," he said quietly, "they are not." He left the library shortly after, his footsteps deliberate and quiet on the stone floor, and Cecily sat alone in the warmth of it for a long time before she opened the book again. What she did not allow herself, even privately, was hope. This was the instruction her wound had given her, specific and repeated over 14 months, that the most honest thing she could do with the situation she was in was understand what it was. She was a penniless companion at a winter house party, wearing a retrimmed gown and another woman's mantle, in a house that belonged to a man, in mourning, whose mother had already categorized and dismissed her twice in 3 days. What she felt in the library, the particular quality of attention that had passed between them, was real. She trusted that. She did not trust what it could become. The 4th day was the winter ball. Lady Dorothea had planned it with the precision she brought to all her public orchestrations, and the long gallery at Ashford Park was altered by the work of 2 days into something that caught the light at every surface, candles in the sconces and on the sideboards, the floor cleared and polished, the musicians arranged at the far end in the alcove. 30 guests plus the local families invited for the evening, which increased the number to something nearer 50, all of them arranged in the long gallery's amber light, with the specific social density of a Regency assembly, every position legible, and every face being read by every other face. Miss Vivian Crail wore pale gold silk, and her mother's pearls, and she moved through the room with the ease of a woman who has understood since childhood that rooms were designed for exactly this purpose. Lady Dorothea had placed her near the Duke, with the geometric precision of a woman who has decided that this campaign will be resolved tonight. Cecily had dressed with care, which was all she had to dress with. The gray-blue gown with its lighter ribbon trim, her hair simply arranged, no jewels, because she had none left after the sale of her mother's pieces the previous summer to address the last of the £412. She looked, she knew, exactly what she was. A woman of good breeding and diminished circumstance, clear-eyed about it, present in the room because she had been invited to be present, and not for any other reason. The Duke had danced once with Miss Alderton the younger, and once with a neighbor's wife whose husband watched from the card-room. He had not danced with Miss Crail. He had been standing near the terrace door for the last quarter hour, a glass in his hand that had not been raised, when his mother moved toward him with Miss Crail at her side and Mr. Fitch at a discreet distance behind. Cecily noticed Mr. Sat. Fitch. She had not seen him at any point in the preceding 4 days and did not understand his presence, but she noticed him with the particular attention her circumstances had trained into her for documents and officials, and the kind of men who carried folded papers in their coat pockets. Lady Dorothea's voice, when she addressed the assembled guests nearest the terrace door, was perfectly calibrated, warm, and carrying. The voice of a woman making a social announcement she has earned the right to make. "I am delighted to present Miss Vivian Crail to His Grace, the Duke of Ashford," she said with the specific brightness of a woman completing a design who, some of you will remember, was acquainted with the late Miss Crail, that is, the late Mrs. Whitmore the mother. A most fitting renewal of the connection. Miss Hartwell's little season has quite run its course, I think we all understand. Miss Hartwell's little season. The third voicing of it, and the unkindest, because it implied a presumption on Cecily's part that Cecily had never made and would never have made. Cecily felt the silence that followed land on her from 30 directions. She was aware of the Duke, at the far edge of her vision, going very still, in the manner of something that was containing a tremendous amount of force within a very small space. It was at this moment that Mr. Fitch moved. He had been instructed, Cecily understood afterward, to present the document at this point in the evening, and he did so with the face of a man who had been told he was doing something routine and was only now understanding that it was not. He unfolded a single sheet and held it where the nearest guests could read the heading. Her father's name. The debt record. £412. Settled but documented. The notation in the solicitor's hand. The late Mr. Dix. Hartwell's accounts, Lady Dorothea said, with the air of a woman completing a kindness, which make clear the nature of the connection Miss Hartwell has been hoping to cultivate. A daughter of debt does not belong in this house. I say so, not with unkindness, but with the clarity that Ashford Park requires. Cecily heard it all. She was very good by now, at hearing things that were said about her in rooms where she was standing. She kept her hand still. She did not cry, because she had not cried in front of anyone since her father's funeral, and she was not going to begin tonight. She looked at Mr. Dipper. Fitch and she looked at the document, and she understood with perfect clarity that the document was real, the debt was real, and that she was going to leave this room. She gathered her borrowed mantle from the chair by the door, the long blue wool with the velvet edge, and she walked toward the corridor, with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that her exit will not be ashamed even if the room has decided to make it so. She was almost at the door when she heard him. Not his voice, his step. She had learned the quality of his step over 4 days, without meaning to, because she had learned everything about him without meaning to. Quick and level, the step of a man who has decided something and is not reconsidering. 3 strides across the long gallery floor, the crowd parting with the reflexive movement of a room that understands that something is about to happen. Cecily stopped. She did not turn immediately. She heard the room go quiet in the specific way that 30 people go quiet, when they are all attending to the same point. "Miss Hartwell," he said, directly behind her. She turned. He was close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the candlelight, that clear winter gray. He was not looking at his mother or at Miss Crail or at Mr. Fitch. He was looking at her with the full, uncloseted quality of a man who has decided that whatever it costs him to look, he will pay it. He reached out and took the borrowed mantle gently from her arm. Then he turned to face the room. "Mr. Fitch," he said, in the level carrying voice of a man who is accustomed to being heard, "you will confirm, for the assembled company, whether that document has any bearing whatsoever on my authority within my own house." Mr. Fitch cleared his throat. He looked at the document, and he looked at the Duke, and he said, with the careful precision of a man who is glad to have been asked a question he can answer honestly, None whatsoever, your grace. The estate's authority, in the matter of guests, is entirely the Duke's. The document went back into his coat pocket. Lady Dorothea had not moved. Her fan was held at a measured height. Something had shifted in her face in the moment between the Duke's step forward and this moment. The thing that happens when a script that has worked for 30 years encounters the one scene it was not written for. The Duke looked at Cecily. "Only at Cecily, I believe," he said, and his voice was very quiet and carried to every corner of the room. "That this is where you belong." 6 words. They were not, technically, a declaration. They were a statement of fact, delivered by a man who has the authority to determine facts in this room. And every person in the long gallery of Ashford Park understood what they meant, including the 30 faces that had looked away from Cecily a moment ago and were now looking at her again. Miss Crail stood very still in her amber silk. She was not a cruel person. She was a person whose entire understanding of the evening had just been revised, and her face carried the particular look of someone who has been arranging furniture in a room they were never meant to occupy. Lady Dorothea's fan lowered fractionally in the involuntary motion of a hand that has let go of something. Cecily looked at the Duke, at the cleared gray of his eyes and the stillness of his face, and the borrowed mantle still over his arm at his side, as though he intended to carry it for exactly as long as she would let him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, lower than she expected it to be, "you are very certain." "I have not," he said, "been certain of many things in 2 years. I am certain of this." The room held its breath. Someone later would say they heard the snow beginning again against the gallery windows. But Cecily heard only the precise quality of the silence after he spoke, which was the silence of a judgment being revised in 30 minds simultaneously. She did not say anything further. She did not need to. She turned back toward the room and let him place the mantle, not the borrowed blue wool, but his own coat, which he had removed from his own shoulders, with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man performing an act. He has thought about more carefully than it looks. Across hers. Mrs. Holt was standing in the doorway to the servants' corridor. She had come to the threshold when she heard the shift in the room's quality, the way a long-experienced housekeeper hears what is about to happen in a house before it happens, and she stood there with her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression she reserved for things that were, at last, correct. Her eyes found Cecily's across the long gallery. They held for a moment. Then the housekeeper permitted herself a small, precise nod and stepped back through her door. The music, after a moment, resumed. Lady Dorothea withdrew to the far end of the room with the measured dignity of a woman who has understood that she has been overridden and has decided to receive this with as much grace as the moment will allow. She was not a small person. She had been wrong, and she knew it, and the knowing was visible in the new angle of her shoulders. She did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. Miss Crail danced, later, with a young baronet from the neighboring estate who had been trying to speak to her since supper. She danced with an ease that suggested relief. The evening continued. Cecily stood in the warm amber center of the long gallery and felt the room's attention shift the way a weather vane shifts and orient toward her. And she did not know what to do with that, except stand still and let it happen. She had spent 14 months learning the procedure of disappearing gracefully, and she had no equivalent procedure for this. The Duke stood beside her. He said after a time, "I owe you an apology for my mother and for the use she made of Mr. Fitch." She said, "Mr. Fitch appeared to be rather surprised by his own errand." That thing at the edge of his expression moved again, more definitively this time, and she saw clearly what it was, what it became when it was finally permitted. A quiet warmth, specific to her, like a candle in a room that has been dark for 2 years and 4 months. "He," was the Duke said. "I will be having a conversation with him about the proper scope of his instructions." "Will it be a short conversation?" she asked. "A very short one," he said. "He is not, in the end, the problem." He did not say what the problem was, or had been. She did not ask. They stood together in the amber light, and the music moved through the room around them, and Cecily let herself do the thing she had been most careful not to do. She let herself stay. By the time the last guests had departed for their rooms and the musicians were wrapping their instruments and the footmen were moving through the gallery with their snuffers, the snow had returned in earnest to the windows. Cecily stood at the glass of the long gallery and watched it come down, the flakes visible against the dark of the park beyond, steady and deliberate, covering the frost-hardened kitchen garden and the iron gate at the south lawn and the lane where the carriages had come in. She was still wearing his coat. She had meant to return it a dozen times during the evening, and each time something had intervened. A word, a turn of the conversation, a moment in which returning it would have required a gesture that would have undone something. And so she had kept it, and the warmth of it was the particular warmth of a thing that had been chosen rather than assigned. She heard his step in the gallery behind her. He came to stand beside her at the window, and for a time they simply watched the snow. "Eleanor," he said after a while, "would have liked you." It was the most careful thing he could have offered her, and she understood it as what it was. Not a comparison, not a replacement, but an introduction. A man opening a door between two parts of his life that he had believed would never share the same hallway. "Tell me about her," Cecily said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he began. She listened through the snow and the dying candlelight, and when he finished, she said nothing. Immediately only stood beside him in the warmth of his coat, and the silence was of the kind that holds rather than presses. "I read to your parlor maid," she said finally. "Agnes." "I did not know at the time that anyone saw." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I know," he said. She met his eyes, and this time she did not look away. There was a great deal more in the weeks and months that followed that could be said in the exact catalogue of what was decided and when. Mr. Prynick sat. Fitch returned to Ashford Park in January in his proper professional capacity, rather than as a dowager's instrument, and the conversation he had with the Duke in the study was indeed a short one, followed by a longer and rather different kind of conversation that required a license and a vicar and an early spring morning in the Ashford chapel with Mrs. Fortanger, Holt, and a handful of household witnesses who had been praying for something of this kind since December. The portrait of Eleanor was moved from the small room off the library before the spring. The Duke carried it himself, as he had moved it the first time, but in the opposite direction, back along the long gallery to the brighter-colored rectangle near the inner window, where he hung it with the same careful intention with which he did all things that mattered to him. He showed Cecily the portrait on the afternoon he rehung it, the two of them standing together in the gallery light, and he held her hand while they looked. "She should be here," he said. "Yes," Cecily said she should. The portrait stayed there. It was part of the gallery now, part of the house as Cecily came to know it. Part of the life she was building, in the rooms she had first entered with a borrowed mantle and a retrimmed gown and the practiced procedure of invisibility that she did not need anymore. By the following winter, the kitchen garden under frost was hers. She walked it on still mornings before the house had fully woken, with Mrs. Holt's steady companionship and a list of what might be planted in the spring. Mrs. Pratt. Holt had a great many opinions about the kitchen garden, and Cecily had learned to seek them out, because the housekeeper's knowledge of Ashford Park was the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands and the feet and the 30 years of walking its floors, and Cecily wanted that knowledge inside her understanding of the place she had been given. One evening in December, near the first anniversary of the winter ball, Cecily sat by the fire in the small sitting room that had once been kept closed, its door now open to the library, the portrait of Eleanor visible through the doorway in the outer gallery. The fire was the particular amber of seasoned oak. The snow had begun against the window again exactly as it had begun the year before, steady and deliberate. She had a book in her lap, the collection of English verse, small printed that she had carried in her pocket since her father's death. It was worn at the spine now, the cover softened by a year of daily handling. He came in from the library and settled in the chair across from her, and watched her read. She was aware of his watching, in the same way she had been aware of his attention from the first evening, with the clarity of someone who has stopped telling herself, "It means nothing." She looked up. "Agnes is better," she said. Mrs. Better. Holt said she was down at breakfast this morning. Good, he said. She looked back at her book. The fire settled in the grate with a small domestic sound, the sound of a house in comfortable occupation. Outside, the snow covered the kitchen garden and the iron gate and the lane, and Ashford Park held the two of them inside its warmth, and the borrowed mantle was gone. And the door that had been closed for 2 years and 4 months was open, and the light in the gallery was steady. Cecily turned the page. This was home. If Cecily's journey stayed with you, leave a comment telling us the moment that landed hardest. There are many more stories like this one. Stay close, and we will keep telling them.